Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the third NJ Yasasvi Memorial Lecture organized by IBS Business School, Kolkata. Shri NJ Yasasvi once said, "I will not sit on this chair even for a day more if I am not able to deliver my best." For the first time ever, he excused himself from a meeting that he chaired at 12 noon on 12th September and had to be admitted to hospital. Unfortunately, on 8th October, the same year, he passed away. Today we are here to commemorate his memory through delivery of a lecture by a luminary, and that is our best tribute to him. May I request Dr. Ajay Pathak, Director of IBS Kolkata, to please come on stage, sir. Our chief guest this evening is Mr. Kalyan Debnath. Mr. Debnath is a postgraduate in physics and a CFA in addition to having professional qualifications of CAIIB. Currently working with the Peerless Group as Executive Vice President, he looks after various new diversification initiatives of the Peerless Group, business process reengineering as well as quality control. Prior to joining Peerless, he was Associate Director at Ernst & Young, where he led risk management services of the firm. In his career, which spans about 40 years, he has varied experience in the leadership role of being a banker, a consultant, an academician, an administrator, and in institution building. He was the founder, dean, and director of ICFI Business School, Kolkata. Welcome back, sir. And currently he is on the board of governors of ICFI and ICFI University. We are very, very pleased to have you with us here today, this evening, sir. May I request Professor Kalyan Debnath to come on stage, please. The speaker this evening to deliver the third NJ Yasasvi Memorial Lecture is so well known to Kolkata's intellectual fraternity, and frankly, it seems a temerity on my part to attempt to introduce him. Shri Abhirup Sarkar obtained his bachelor's degree in economics from Residency College, Calcutta, and a master's from University of Calcutta. He then went on to his PhD from the University of Rochester and has spent most of his academic career at the Indian Statistical Institute in Kolkata. He has taught at various other places in India and abroad, including the University of Florida, Brigham Young University, Concordia University, Canada, International Center of Economic Research, Italy, and of course the Indian Institute of Management, Kolkata. The primary areas of his research interests are international trade and economic development. Apart from contributing to scholarly journals, he writes regular popular pieces in dailies and periodicals. He is the chairman of WBIDFC, vice chairman of WBIDC, and a member of the West Bengal State Planning Board. Sir, it is our honor and our privilege to have you here today to deliver the third NJ Yasasvi Memorial Lecture. May I invite Professor Abhirup Sarkar on stage, please.
Me here and for giving me this opportunity to speak. I'll be speaking on a topic which should be of public interest, especially in a country like India, which is aspiring to become a developed nation and which can boast of having the largest democracy in the world, in terms of population at least. The issue that I'm going to talk about is basically centered around the question of the relationship between economic development and democracy. So let me introduce the issue. Let me just try to elucidate what I have in mind. You see, over the last 2 decades or so, a large number of countries all over the world have become democratic. So, just to give you some idea about the democratization process that is going on in the world, you can look at a figure published by an organization called Freedom House. Freedom House was established, I think, in 1972 in the US, and its main objective is to foster and promote democracy all over the world. Now, Freedom House every year comes up with a report on world democracy. Now, according to Freedom House, in 1989, only 41% of the 167 countries in the world practiced electoral democracy. Only 41%. By 2012, while the number of countries had increased to 195, the number increased because of division of countries and so on, the proportion of countries with electoral democracy had increased to 60%. So from 41% to 60%. That was clearly a significant increase in the number of countries practicing electoral democracy. Now, that in itself is good news, of course. Democracy is something that we all cherish. But the more important question is, has this, spread of democracy as an institution, has it actually improved political rights, civil liberties, and economic freedom? In other words, even though it's true that the number of countries practicing democracy has increased, can we say that the quality of democracy practiced by these countries has also improved as well? This is the basic question that we shall look at. Now, how to measure the quality of democracy? There are various organizations. Freedom House, I just mentioned Freedom House, that's one, which comes up with an annual report on world democracy. Similarly, there are other organizations as well. For example, the Economist magazine, they have a democracy index. They have a unit called Economist Intelligence Unit, which publishes a democracy index, which tries to rank the quality of democracy across nations. Now, Economist magazine basically divides the countries into 4 categories. One is full democracy, then they have flawed democracy, then hybrid regimes, partly democratic, partly something else, and finally authoritarian regimes. So there are four categories. And the classification of a country is based on a number of variables, number of indicators like civil liberties, on how elections are conducted, the number of people participating in the election process, and so on and so forth, on media freedom, and so on and so forth. In 2012, the total number of countries listed by the Democracy Index is 214, out of which 116 are electoral democracies. Okay, so we'll look at 116 electoral democracies. Economist magazine, according to Economist magazine's categorization, out of these 116 countries, only 25, about 21.6% are classified as full democracy. Okay, and about 64% as flawed democracy, and the remaining 16, about 13.8%, as having hybrid regimes. We are just talking about countries which have electoral democracy. Out of that, this is the classification. Now, on the other hand, the reason I'm quoting these figures is that these organizations come up with varied, estimates about the quality of democracy. So, Freedom House, if you just want to compare Freedom House's rankings with the earlier one, Freedom House ranks countries again on the basis of political freedom and civil liberties. In 2013, they have listed 194 countries, out of which, as I said, 116 are electoral democracies. Now, and their categories are different, slightly different. They classify countries as free, partly free, and not free. And out of these 116 electoral democracies, Freedom House categorizes about 76% of the countries as free and only 23% as partly free. So, you see, there is a wide variation in the estimates of the quality of democracy. What to make out of this? Very difficult to make out of these figures, which are varying a lot. But be that as it may, one thing is common to not only to the Economist magazine's report and the Freedom House's report, it is also common with other reports. There are various other reports. One thing is common, and that is the democracy rankings, or the quality of democracy in poorer countries are definitely lower than that of rich countries. So this is always true. Whatever absolute standard you have for your democracy, that could be subjective, but the thing that is common to all these studies or all these reports is that poorer countries tend to have weaker democracies compared to their richer counterparts. And this is precisely what we are going to talk about. We are going to understand why economic development is, the stage at which you are in is important for the functioning of the democracy that you have. This is what we are going to talk about. Now, the positive relationship between democracy and the standard of living, this is empirically, it has been observed again and again, as I said. This positive relationship was first hypothesized by Seymour Lipset in 1959. That was a long time ago. He was a political scientist who traced its origin to the writings of Aristotle. So the idea is not at all new. It's known for years and years, centuries after centuries. the idea is that in order to have a proper democracy, you have to have economic development first. Otherwise, democracy cannot work. That is the idea. So, this is an old idea. It was hypothesized by Lipset and also mentioned by Aristotle long time ago. More recently, in 1999, an economist, a very famous one, Robert Barrow of Harvard, he actually tested, statistically tested to see whether there is a correlation between the quality of democracy and the standard of living. This was a very rigorous work, came out in a journal called Journal of Political Economy, which is one of the top journals in economics. And while the quality of democracy was measured by indicators of political rights and civil liberties and so on, standard of living was measured by per capita GDP and primary school attainment. Okay. And Barrow found out that quality of democracy and standard of living are significantly positively correlated. So if standard of living increases, quality of democracy improves. Statistically, he found that out. That was in 1999. There were other research work in the same area. In 2006, Acemoglu and Robinson, Acemoglu is from MIT and Robinson is from Harvard. They have come up with a book which looks at a similar, relationship, and they have demonstrated, they have used Freedom House data, and they have added some other data. There is another data set called Polity4, and they have come up with, I don't want to get into technicalities too much, but they have constructed a composite polity index, basically representing the quality of democracy of a country, and try to see that how far this is correlated with the level of per capita income and average years of schooling. And it turned out that both are positively correlated, significantly and positively correlated. Acemoglu and Robinson also found that over the period 1960 to 1995, democracy, quality of democracy in the OECD countries has consistently remained at the top, followed by Latin America, followed by Asia, and at the bottom you have Africa. So, if you look at the time series, over the years, 1960 to 1995, the rich countries have always remained at the top in terms of the quality of their democracy, followed by Latin America, and then Asia, and then Africa. There are other researchers as well. Przeworski, he is a political scientist in New York University. He has made a distinction between democracy and non-democracy, and they have chosen a different index according to Przeworski and his co-workers. Democracy, in order to qualify as democracy, there has to be at least one peaceful change in the government in the past. So unless you have one peaceful change in the government in the past, you cannot call it a democracy, according to them. So according to this definition, South Africa is still, it's not a democracy. They have not have any change in government so far. Anyway, so whatever be the standard, again they have come up with the conclusion that not only affluent countries have higher tendency to be democratic, they have a higher chance of remaining democratic. So democracy is more permanent in these countries. Anyway, so I can keep on giving accounts of the existing work, but let us not do that. It's not very interesting. Basic idea is that empirically it's well established that richer countries have a better quality democracy than poorer countries. And so the question is why? What is the explanation? Now, if you look at, well, being a student of economics, I looked at mainly at the literature on political economy, the mainstream political economy. And there, the basic model, as we call it in economics, we always go by a model. The basic model that is used in the mainstream political economy is one that was suggested by Anthony Downs in 1957. It's pretty old. The model is like this. Just consider two parties, political parties, engaged in a, in an election. So there is election, there is democracy, there is going to be an election, and there are two political parties. Imagine a straight line on which you are basically representing different policies. So if you go left of the straight line, you become more left. You adopt leftist policies. If you go right, then you adopt rightist policies. So these two parties, they have to, before the election, they have to adopt some policy stance in that straight line. The voters are distributed over the straight line. Okay, so a voter would vote for that party which is nearer to its most preferred point. Okay, so a voter has a most preferred point on the line, and he would vote for that party which is nearer to his most preferred point. So this is the framework, and the basic conclusion of this model is the so-called median voter theorem, which is very well known in the political economy literature. It says that political parties will try to adopt the policy which is most preferred by the median voter. The person who is just at the middle, he has a most preferred point, and both parties would adopt exactly that point. Now, that is a theoretical model, that's a theoretical prediction. It has several implications. The first implication is that both parties would be adopting the same kind of policy, at least announce the same kind of policy before the election. Second, both will be adopting some kind of a middle path. No extreme, policies would be chosen. Third, the model would suggest that most people, that policy would be chosen which is preferred by most people because it's a democracy. And fourth, it is assumed that political parties honor their pre-election commitments. Now, none of these conclusions would hold in reality. First of all, political parties, we have seen that they do not usually honor their pre-election commitments, not always. But also, the puzzle is that in a country like India, where most people are poor, if the median policy is chosen, then we would have observed more pro-poor policies than we actually, have. So, because it's a democracy, because, you see, let me just point out one thing, just as a digression. Democracy is an institution like the market. Market is another institution. But democracy is more equitable than the market in the following sense. If you have more money, you have more power in the market. But in democracy, whether you are poor or rich, you have one single vote. So in that sense, democracy fosters more equality. So if that is so, in a country like India, where most people are poor, one would have expected the governments, whoever the government is, to adopt more pro-poor policies, and poverty should vanish. After so many years of independence, we should not observe that much poverty. But we do not, observe that. So we do have poor, we do have policies which are not strictly pro-poor and so on. So this Downshian theory doesn't explain much, at least as far as less developed countries are concerned. It doesn't explain much. Of course, there are variations of Downshian theory. In 1987, two economists, Assar Lindbeck and John Weibull, they sort of changed the Downshian theory a little bit. They sort of, introduced the notion that it's not only the announced policy of the political party, but also, personal charisma or personal liking of the voter. All these things would matter. Caste would matter. A host of things could matter. But more importantly, the less educated the electorate, the less would be the chance of a voter to understand what is going on. To understand what a political party is really announcing, what are the implications of the policies that they are announcing, and so on. So, in a country like India, where we still have a significant fraction of the voters who are not so educated, they are not aware. So it's very easy to fool them, if you like. If you want to use the word fool, then it's easy to fool them. In fact, in a country like India, what you have is, on the one hand, there is a trade-off. As far as a political party is concerned, there is a trade-off. On the one hand, you can adopt pro-poor policies, direct pro-poor policies, and get more votes. That's possible. On the other hand, you have to run huge elections, which involves huge cost. And for that you need donations, and for that, to get those donations, you have to depend on a handful of the rich people of the society. So you can call it a class struggle, not in the Marxian sense, but it is definitely a class struggle. On the one hand, you need money to run elections, and for that you have to depend on the rich. On the other hand, to get votes, you have to depend on the poor. So you have to strike the right kind of balance between these two. And as a result, you see, even if there are so many poor people, you do not observe that many, pro-poor policies. And the condition of the poor, it's changing, all right, but it's changing slowly. So this is one kind of explanation that one can provide. It depends upon lack of education, awareness of the general voters, and that is the reason why the quality of democracy is not so high in less developed countries. Now, there are two problems with this. At least the way I see it, there are two problems with this proposition. Number one, it is not exactly true that the poor people are not aware. In fact, in my thesis, which I'll put forward in a moment, I think the poor people are more political than the rich, because their livelihood depends upon what kind of policies the government is taking. People like you and me, who are in the formal sector, who have a stable job, we do not depend on the government that much. But the poor people do. So it's not true that the poor people are unaware of politics. In fact, they are very much aware of politics. This is number one. Number two, it's not very plausible to think that, to say that the poor can be fooled again and again. How can the poor be repeatedly fooled? They can be fooled once, because of their unawareness. But you cannot fool them again and again. So I think whatever theory one has to put forward, one has to account for the fact that the poor are very much into politics. They understand and they have their own take on the political situation of the country. We have to incorporate that in our theory. Let me mention, there is another branch of literature, like I mentioned Acemoglu Robinson, there are other people also. This branch basically says that the relationship between democracy and development largely depends upon inequality. So they actually bring in inequality, and they think that there is a big relationship, there is a very important relationship between inequality and democracy. Why? Let me explain. If you have low inequality, but suppose you do not have democracy or very low level of democracy, like in, let's say, Singapore. Okay, in Singapore you do not have democracy, but inequality is also low. Because inequality is low, the poor, the relatively poor, I mean, the poor do not have the incentive of pushing for more democratic rights, because they are doing fine. There are always costs of pushing these things. So because you are doing fine economically, you do not have the incentive of pushing for more democratic rights. On the other hand, the other extreme, where you have extreme form of inequality in Latin American countries, there, if there is a switch over to democracy from an authoritarian regime, the rich are going to lose a lot. So they will try to protect the authoritarian regime with all their force, because they have high stakes, and that comes from inequality, huge inequality. So again, there also you do not observe democracy. It's in the middle, countries like the UK, the USA, or other European countries, Argentina and so on, where the inequality is somewhere in the somewhere in between, where there is a social understanding that you have to have democratic rights, otherwise the poor will demonstrate, they will try to push for more rights and so on, and these democratic rights are given to them because the rich are not losing a lot in terms of their income. Inequality is already low, not very high, I would say. So it's like an U-shaped curve. With high inequality you have low democracy. Sorry, it's inverted U. With high inequality you have low democracy. With low inequality again you have low democracy. But in between you have high democracy, in the middle. This is one kind of theory. Again, this theory does not help us much, in the sense that here the distinction is between democracy and no democracy. What we are trying to understand is the quality of democracy where we already have an electoral system, where we already have elections, but the quality of democracy is not very high. So we are trying to understand that. So I will, for the remaining time, I will devote to what my thesis is about, explaining the relationship between the standard of living and the quality of democracy. Now, I will try to explain this through the existence of an informal sector. So let me just try to explain what I mean by that. By an informal sector, I mean a whole bunch of things. But the common thing is that in an informal sector, you do not have well-defined property rights. Now, this could be, an example could be a small, business which is unregistered, which is not paying taxes or paying the minimum wage. That could be one example. Or it could be someone, a hawker selling his stuff on the pavement, who doesn't have the right to be on the pavement, but still he is doing his business. Or someone who is encroaching on government land. Or some poor people who is not well protected from hooligans, let's say, from musclemen. The law is too expensive to implement. So what I mean is, there are a whole bunch of people who are in this informal sector. In a country like India, it's a huge percentage. World Bank has some figures. Now, the main point is that because these people are not well protected, they don't have proper property rights to protect them, they need political protection for their livelihood. So I think this is the basic politics of an underdeveloped country. People like you and me, we are in the formal sector. We don't have to depend on any political party. But for people, for poorer people, because they have to survive, they need political protection. Okay? And this political protection is given by the political parties in exchange of votes. Not only in exchange of votes, these people, they can, visibly join the party's meetings and, demonstrations. They can even act as musclemen if the need arises. All these things we have seen in India, but you can see this in other less developed countries as well, in Bangladesh or in Latin America, Africa, everywhere you can see that. So the point is that because you are vulnerable, because a person in the informal sector is vulnerable, he or she has to depend, he or she needs political protection. And this protection is provided in exchange of his political loyalty. So this is the thing. Now, if that is the case, if votes are bought through by giving small favors, then there are at least two implications of this. One is that the quality of democracy is definitely going to suffer, because no one is concerned about how the government is functioning. Everyone, or not everyone, maybe people in the formal sector are concerned with the functioning of the government, but people in the informal sector, as an individual, he would be concerned with his personal benefits. He would be, for example, a hawker would be concerned with the fact that, whether he is thrown out of his pavement or not, right? So on the one hand, there is a law which can throw him out, but on the other hand, political parties would, protect this person from this law, because that is how you can get his loyalty. So the point is that most people belonging to the informal sector, they do not care, they wouldn't care about the general economic situation. They would care for their survival and care about their immediate benefits from different political parties. This is number one. Number two, because the party which is in power has more, power to distribute benefits, you would observe immediate switches from one party to another. This is something that you will observe. Okay. So if that happens, then political changes are very difficult to come by. The probability, once you are in power, the probability of remaining in power would be high. So that is another problem with democracy. Democracy typically should punish the non-performing government, and here that is not happening. So you can, these are all testable hypotheses. You can see whether this contagion is taking place. You know, voting behavior could be like a contagious disease. You switch from one party to the other. These things can be tested. But that is, you know, that will need much more serious work. But here, what you can immediately see that there is clearly a negative relationship between the quality of democracy and the percentage of an economy in the informal sector. Okay, so I just run some regressions and just calculated some correlation. You know, I just looked at the percentage of GDP coming from the informal sector of a country on the one hand, and on the other hand looked at the quality of democracy. Just looked at global democracy ranking, that is another you know, organization which comes up with democracy ranking, and I found that there is a 0.67 correlation positive, which is pretty high, okay, between informalization and the quality of democracy. It should be negative actually, negative of 0.67. Higher the level of informalization, lower is the quality of democracy. So this is all very, you know, not very heartening. This is, I don't think that we don't have any hope or anything like that. One way to get out of all this is to create more opportunities for the poor people. Once the poor has more opportunity, he would not typically depend on political favors for his survival, and then he can vote on his own. You know, he can decide with this, whether this government is functioning properly or not, and only then a democracy can function. So the question is how to create more opportunities. I think globalization is one. So with globalization, you see all sorts of small, medium, large, different enterprises, different scopes, different opportunities are coming up. Once you get globalized, you know, in economics, like we say, no arbitrage condition. Wherever there is a possibility of profit, people would go there and earn that profit. This is the beauty of the market. So with more globalization, with more opening up of the market, people will have more opportunities, and only then their political dependence would fall, and only then democracy can work. So that is the positive note with which I would like to end my lecture, and I will be very happy to take questions. Thank you.